I feel it a great privilege to be here tonight to inaugurate these Rutherford Lectures. I've been very much intrigued and interested in the project which Dr. Barber has described, because I think there is a great need for living history in this new, complicated world on which we're embarked. I appreciate very much your remarks, Dr. Barber, but I must confess that my experience in traveling back and forth across America, speaking in behalf of the Panama Canal treaties, leads me to doubt whether I deserve such praise. In any event, I am unaccustomed to it. At nearly every stop, I was greeted by people in terms not quite as laudatory as those you have employed. I recall one sign particularly. It read, "Archie Bunker is smarter than Ellsworth." Perhaps the invitation should have gone to Archie. Today I want to talk about American diplomacy, to focus on the process of managing international relations, which is what diplomacy is about, rather than a discussion of foreign policy itself. The manner in which we have conducted foreign policy has done as much, perhaps, to shape the times in which we live as have the policies themselves. And it will do much to shape the contours of the world in which you who are members of this university community are about to take your place. Harold Nicholson, earlier in this century, has said that of all callings, diplomacy is the most protean. It required all the best qualities of the historian, the jurist, the linguist, the author, the artist, the philosopher, and the technical specialist. As one looks back to that period, when that was written, scarcely more than a generation ago, one becomes aware of the fact that not only has the world become increasingly interdependent, but also that international relations have become increasingly complex. When the United Nations was started, I think there were 51 members. In 1950, there were 60. When I was a delegate to the 11th Assembly, in 56, there were 81. Today, there are 150. The era of the nation state has come into being full-blown. That this development has made the conduct of diplomacy infinitely more complex and difficult is obvious. It seems to me also that the study of diplomacy must occupy an important place if the conduct of foreign policy is to match the demands which increasingly will be made upon it. All Americans today have to summon a full range of qualities to assess the choices before us, choices that no longer are as simple or straightforward as even in our recent past. There is much talk today about there being a new diplomacy, a need for people-to-people diplomacy, about global issues requiring global solutions, and thus multilateral diplomacy, and that the people need to be more associated with the diplomacy of a democratic country. All this is true, but it is not the subject of my address to you today. I wish to talk about what has happened, what has endured in the practice of diplomacy, about what is as valid today as it was in the days of our founding fathers, and even before their time. Whatever claim I have to talk to you about those enduring values derives from my own personal experience. It is a widespread belief that the effectiveness of a diplomatist derives from his cleverness, his ability to spin webs of intrigue, his ability in some way to outsmart and perhaps to trick or outmaneuver the people with whom he negotiates. This is not a new notion. Sir Henry Wotton said in 1614 that a diplomat is an honest man sent abroad to lie for his country. This sentence is still quoted in our day, but most of the people who cite it are unaware that as a result of that statement, Sir Henry lost the confidence of his sovereign and was never again used in a diplomatic capacity. In vain did he explain that the remark had been intended as a mere merriment. His employer, James I, understood only too well that witticism had destroyed Sir Henry's usefulness as a diplomat, and a moment's reflection will show us why that was the case. If a diplomat tries to serve his country by lying to a foreign government, he can do so only once. After he is found out to be a prevaricator, anything he says will be greeted with the utmost skepticism, even when he speaks the truth. In effect, he will have squandered his most valuable asset, which is the respect that a foreign government develops for the representative of another country, a respect that is a long-term asset both for the diplomat and for his country. I would go even further. When a diplomat becomes widely known in the country of his accreditation as being unreliable, as playing fast and loose with the truth, even if this is the result of a lack of precision rather than sharp practice, that reputation will dog him not only in the country of his assignment, but also in subsequent assignments in other countries. And the contrary is also true to some extent. If a diplomat acquires the reputation of being honest, reliable, and fair, even while, of course, standing up for the interests of his own country, this will stand him in good stead in the places to which he may be assigned in the future. The French diplomat, François de Callière, put the thought much better in the 17th century than I could set it forth today. The good negotiator, he wrote, will never found the success of his mission on promises which he cannot redeem or on bad faith. It is a capital error which prevails widely that a clever negotiator must be a master in the art of deceit. Deceit, indeed, is but a measure of the smallness of mind of him who employs it, and simply shows that his intelligence is too meagerly equipped to enable him to arrive at his ends by just and reasonable methods. No doubt the art of lying has been practiced with success in diplomacy, but unlike that of honesty, which here as elsewhere is the best policy, a lie always leaves a drop of poison behind, and even the most dazzling diplomatic success gained by dishonesty stands on an insecure foundation. And he went on to say, in general, it should be the highest aim of the diplomat to gain such a reputation for good faith that both at home and abroad they will place reliance both upon his information and upon the advice that he gives. From my own experience, I can cite one example of the benefit of a reputation for honesty and integrity. When I was trying to work out an agreement between Egypt and Saudi Arabia in 1963 involving the disengagement of Egyptian troops from Yemen, I found King Faisal of Saudi Arabia much tougher to deal with than Nasser, whose forces were overcommitted and bogged down in Yemen. And Faisal knew that, and he wasn't about to let him off the hook. Finally, after a period of primitive shuttle diplomacy, in those days done under DC-3, I may say, not in Air Force One, I put forward a proposal to both sides. Faisal's response was, I do not trust Nasser, but I will sign this because I trust you. Another aspect of diplomacy, which seems to get more attention than it is worth, is characterized by a remark that goes back to Charles Dawes, a one-time American ambassador to the court of St. James. He said, diplomacy is easy on the head, but hell on the feet. To which a colleague of his, Hugh Gibson, responded, it all depends on which end you use. Actually, one has to use both ends. And I certainly subscribe to Mr. Dawes' remark that diplomacy is hard on the feet. Anyone who has stood at endless diplomatic receptions or at march pasts or as part of a delegation at an airport or at that exquisite form of torture known as the cocktail buffet dinner will agree that the profession is hard on the feet, but is even harder on the stomach. There are dishes a guest of honor cannot refuse, however much he might want to. Alas, many a host will consider that the extent of his hospitality will be measured not by the quality alone, but also by the number of courses and dishes he presents to his guest. It must have been a diplomat who remarked once that he was sorry he had only one stomach to give to his country. But the upper end of the anatomy is also of some importance. Certainly running an embassy or conducting negotiations with a foreign government can be a very taxing activity, requiring intellectual stamina. There is a constant need for making judgments, rearranging priorities, interpreting information, and generally keeping abreast of developments so as to be able to anticipate what is coming. And all this has to be done while performing also ceremonial and social functions that may seem glittering to the general public, which are quite onerous when one experiences them as part of one's everyday life. How does one negotiate? Well, every negotiation is, of course, different, but there are certain things they have in common, and one of them is that the negotiator must not only know his own case, what is important, what is more important than something else, and what is desirable rather than important, but he must also try to construct in his mind a hierarchy of priorities for the other side. He must try to put himself in the other fellow's shoes and imagine how he would see the situation from his perspective. In addition to integrity, certainly the capacity for empathy, for putting oneself in the shoes of the negotiator on the other side of the table, and a sense of timing, when to act and when not to act, are key requirements for effective negotiation. There is a widespread belief that negotiations are something in which one side can score a victory over the other. I have heard it said that the art of negotiating is letting the other fellow have your way. That approach looks upon negotiation as what is known as a zero-sum game, a transaction in which one side's loss is the other side's gain. I do not believe that that is either an accurate or a constructive way of looking at negotiations. If the results of a negotiation are to be lasting, they have to carry benefits for both sides. There must be mutual advantage in concluding the transaction. This does not mean that one side necessarily loses what the other gains. It means rather that, as happens very often, each side has some things that are vital, and others that it needs very much, and still others that it needs less. And these are usually not the same things for each side. In addition to integrity and the gift of empathy, I would therefore cite creativity as an important element in successful negotiation. It is the task of the negotiator to maximize those elements which are of most importance to his side, even while allowing the other side, indeed sometimes even urging the other side, to maximize those elements which are different elements that are of importance to that side. One side may give up an immediate advantage for the sake of a long-term advantage, even while the other side is more concerned with the immediate advantage because of certain requirements of its domestic political situation. Many of you will think of Panama in this connection. I happen to believe that the long-term advantage to the United States of the Panama treaties outweighed for us what we gave up. But I would rather use another example for what I've said. The Japanese-American Security Treaty of 1960. When that treaty was negotiated, the United States had virtually all the cards in its hand. It was an occupying power in Japan and operated under an agreement with the Japanese that gave us all we wanted in the way of rights, privileges, and facilities. And some people asked, why should we give this up when we are sitting pretty and have everything we want? How could another treaty be better than the present one? The answer to that question was that the situation prior to 1960 did not involve any mutuality. It involved no common interest or common action between us and Japan. And as that country was developing, becoming more assertive and more conscious of its strength, it had come increasingly to resent arrangements that still cast the United States in the role of an occupying power. So by a creative act of statesmanship, by giving up certain privileges in Japan, we secured something very valuable, namely a relationship of equality and mutuality that made the Japanese our partners rather than our subordinates. And that was a net gain for the United States as well as for Japan. I believe the same thing also applies to Panama, which has every interest in keeping the canal open and in operation, but had come to see American sovereignty as an insult to its national pride. In other words, by an act of creative statesmanship, we gave up something which in the last analysis was of symbolic rather than practical value. It is inconceivable that the United States could operate the canal in a situation in which the people and the government of Panama refused to cooperate in that operation. The Panamanian government obtained something of great value to it, but the United States also obtained something of great value, namely the willing cooperation of Panama, without which, in any case, possession of the canal would have meant little to us. We obtained the basis for the military protection of the canal, which is of great importance to us. The Panamanian government obtained something of equally great importance to it, namely the restoration of sovereignty over its territory. In addition to integrity, empathy, and creativeness, an effective diplomacy must also possess the quality of realism and a sense of timing. Much of what I have said about the trading of short-term for long-term advantage comes under that heading. Unless the negotiator has patience as well as perseverance, in addition to a feeling of empathy for the requirements of the other side. It goes without saying that the negotiator must also be attuned to the interests and political realities of his own country. The best treaty will be of no value if it cannot command the support necessary for its ratification. Perhaps what I have said just now may seem to you a truism, the sort of thing that really goes without saying. But the United States at one time sponsored an international treaty which, upon reflection, can only be termed totally non-substantive. Yet at the time it produced a dangerous atmosphere of euphoria, as if the American Secretary of State had found the means of making future wars impossible. In actual fact, nothing of the sort had been obtained. I am referring to the Kellogg-Briand Treaty of 1928. It declared that all the signatories would settle their differences peacefully and would not resort to war. Negotiation of that treaty posed no difficulties. It was a brief document. The United States and 14 other powers outlawed war as an instrument of national policy. The treaty was worse than useless. It created the impression that something important had been decided. Actually, most of the signatories expressed reservations to the effect that measures of defense would not be affected by it. And what nation has ever described as military measures in other terms than defense? The interesting lesson to be learned from the Kellogg-Briand Pact is that in order to be of value, a treaty of international agreement must involve matters of substance. In addition to realism, I mentioned that a sense of timing is important. Americans are a can-do people. Once engaged, they want to get the job done, and rapidly and directly as possible. But in diplomacy, the opposite approach often is required. That the best response to a foreign initiative may be no response. I recall in Argentina in 1951, we decided to treat the head of government, General Perón, who had been engaging in provocative attacks against our own government, with aloof correctness, initiating nothing without getting something in return, debating nothing, So when General Perón began pushing what he called the third force, supposedly neither communism nor democracy, and pursuing this proposal in ways he knew were provocative to us, our most effective reaction was to refuse to react, to deny him the satisfaction of having the United States engage his proposal on his terms. Perón finally got tired of trying to provoke us, and our relations became tolerable, if not cordial. Much has been written about the role of Congress and public opinion in foreign policy, and I entirely subscribe to the importance of a national consensus for a successful foreign policy. But when it comes to the process of negotiating specific agreements, it is impossible to do so under glaring spotlights in full view of the public. Certainly the results of negotiations will have to be presented to the Congress and explained to the American people, as was the case in the Panama Canal treaties. But fruitful negotiations on a subject of public controversy, and most important subjects involve public controversy in a democracy, can only be conducted in private. We have had proof of that fairly recently in our negotiations to end the Vietnam War. The negotiations that took place in the Hotel Majestic in Paris were, for all practical purposes, propaganda exercises. Each side was talking not to the other side, but primarily to world public opinion. This is not what we wanted, but it became inevitable when the North Vietnamese negotiators converted those negotiations into a means of pressuring American public opinion. There were, in effect, no negotiations at all in the Hotel Majestic. The result of that situation was that the real negotiations had to be conducted in another forum, which was a secret one. As you know, those negotiations were conducted without anyone knowing that they were going on between Dr. Kissinger and the number 4 man in the North Vietnamese power structure, Le Duc Tho. I believe one can broaden this proposition to a general one. Wherever negotiations are being conducted in the glare of public exposure, as for instance in the United Nations, you can be pretty sure that the real negotiations will take place somewhere behind closed doors. Why? Because negotiations involve the trading of something that is less valuable to one side for something that is more highly prized by the other. And that process of trading involves the discussion of various hypothetical possibilities, which may appear preposterous if they are lifted out of their context, but assume meaning when they become part of a whole. I have myself had occasion to invite 2 parties between whom I was mediating to go into sequestration with me in a country estate, far away from the prying of investigative reporters. We remained in seclusion there until we had worked out the larger part of the difficulties. The conflict between the Netherlands and Indonesia involved nationalistic pride and prestige to a much larger extent than concrete interests. Well, West Irian was and is of little intrinsic importance. This does not mean that the negotiations were on non-substantive matters, for the issue was control of a piece of territory and involved great passions on both sides. The agreement I had proposed to the 2 sides had been accepted by both, but almost founded to the last minute on the question of flags, how they were to be flown and how long by each side. The compromise I proposed allowed the Dutch to fly their flags for a longer period. It thus gratified a symbolic aspect of importance to them, even while assuring that control of the territory would pass to the Indonesians. Another desirable quality of diplomacy in general, and of negotiations in particular, is precision. There may be times when calculated ambiguity is necessary in order to bring 2 very different points of view together, or when matters of face rather than substance are at stake. But it is risky, and the chickens hatched in such circumstances can come home to roost in a very disagreeable manner. I'll forego citing recent examples of our diplomacy where that happened, when rejoicing over an apparent agreement turned out to be premature because no real meeting of minds had been achieved in such negotiations. In general, I believe the less clarity and precision there is in an international document, the more likely it is to be ignored by one or more of the signatories. Let me give you two examples. At the Yalta Conference 1945, the Western powers wanted to see an entirely new Polish government constituted, which would be pledged to holding free elections. The Soviet Union, on the other hand, wanted to see a communist-dominated government. Since there already was a provisional communist government in office, they wanted to speak only of reorganizing that government by the addition of other elements. So far, so good. The compromise worked out on this subject at Yalta spoke of reorganizing the existing government, but it also spoke of creating a new government. The West thus thought it had won its point, and the Soviet Union thought its position had been vindicated. The outcome of this ambiguity was one of the most acute disputes between the West and the USSR. On the correspondence between Roosevelt and Churchill on the one side, in the correspondence between Roosevelt and Churchill on the one side and Stalin on the other, each side accused the other of going back on the Yalta decisions. It is perhaps not too strong a statement to say that the ambiguities of the Yalta agreements were among the root causes of the Cold War. Another example of a very different kind are the so-called Helsinki Accords. I don't mean to criticize those accords, for they've had their uses, but they are not really in the nature of international agreements. Technically, they aren't even agreements, but represent the final act of the Helsinki Conference. The document contains long paragraphs on many different subjects, ranging from confidence-building measures in the field of security to the reunification of families with members on both sides of the Iron Curtain. Often it has been claimed that one side or the other has violated its commitments made at Helsinki. However, there are no formal commitments entered into at Helsinki. There were no formal commitments. The final act is in the nature of a Sears Roebuck catalog, listing what each party intends to do. One can criticize some of the parties for not doing, or not doing well enough, or extensively enough, what they predicted they would do at Helsinki. But certainly the Helsinki Final Act is not a precisely drafted legal document. It is essentially a joint declaration of intentions. As I have pointed out before, such excessively broad and vague pronouncements usually do not accomplish what their sponsors claim for them. We are all familiar with a domestic parallel in the form of the party platforms. I don't want to be misunderstood. I think the Helsinki exercise was worthwhile. It was certainly exceedingly tiring on our negotiators, who worked hard and often had to use considerable ingenuity and perseverance and calmness, and I suspect also a sense of humor in the face of provocation. The outcome was worthwhile because it put the signatories, notably the Soviet Union, under some moral obligation to clean up their act. But there is a great difference between moral obligations and legal obligations. Often a negotiator finds the other party so obdurate that he despairs initially of ever coming to terms with it. He may present his proposals in various forms, hoping that one of them will fit the requirements of the other side. He may argue his case brilliantly and try to convince the other side of the reasonableness of his proposals, but may still find the other side totally unyielding on central questions at issue. I found it useful in such situations to imagine that we have hidden allies on the other side whose hand it was my job to strengthen. In other words, I talked to the other delegation as if they were reasonable, even if their position they were taking was not reasonable at all. This thought was well expressed by Sir Charles Webster in his book, The Art and Practice of Diplomacy. He wrote, "A preliminary requisite is for the negotiator to show that he understands and appreciates the necessities of others, and that he is ready, even anxious, to satisfy them so far as he is able. But even in bilateral negotiations, he will often be able to ascertain differences in opinion, or at least emphasis, against members of the other side. For only rarely does an important negotiation take place solely between two individuals. In multilateral negotiations, there will certainly be variety of opinion. He can then encourage and support those aspects which lead in the long run to conclusions which meet his own interests. For the purposes that I have in mind, it doesn't really matter whether in bilateral negotiations the other delegation actually contains such hidden allies. The human brain and the human mind are extremely complex, and the thought processes of other people can very well contain elements that are both conciliatory and unyielding, with one element simply predominating over the other. By adding weights on the side of the scales that favors reasonableness, one appeals to people on the other side who can see the advantages of a compromise. Or if there are no such people on the other side, one must hope that one's arguments will at least be reported to the Home Office of the other delegation, where there may be some more reasonable people in charge. It is therefore not unprofitable to explain the same points again and again, in various forms and permutations, patiently and without losing heart. For if the advantages of what one is proposing have not been reported initially, they may be reported to the other side's decision makers later. And if they are not reported at all, there may be some on the other side, on the other delegation, who sees fit, who sees it to his own advantage to remedy the deficiency in their reporting. In any case, just as a piece of granite rock will not yield to one blow of the hammer and chisel, a seemingly fixed negotiating position of a delegation will not yield to persuasiveness right from the start. Sometime, somehow, a crack may appear and the opening will be created. That allows fruitful negotiations to take place. Often that takes a long time. There are negotiations that have taken many years. If one is too eager for a compromise, one may not get it at all. Or one may have to get one on terms significantly less reasonable than if one gives the negotiating process the chance to work over a period of time. I have spoken of persuasiveness and hope this isn't misunderstood. A negotiation is not like a trial before a court of law in which a silver-tongued orator can score points by the sheer brilliance of his pleading. There is no judge who awards his verdict to the more reasonable or persuasive side. That is why brilliance can be a dubious asset, putting off the other side, which may fear being put at a disadvantage by an excessively clever negotiating partner. Nor does logic necessarily carry the day. I'm reminded of a British negotiator who was musing about his experience with the French, who tend to be brilliantly logical in their argumentation. He said, every time I negotiate with the French, a point will be reached when the French negotiator, having presented his case in Cartesian logic, will lean forward and ask rhetorically and metaphorically, but surely, sir, you must admit that 2 and 2 make 4. To which, said the British negotiator, I invariably reply, absolutely not. And it is only then at this point that fruitful negotiations can resume. This example, you may say, is taken from negotiations between two democratic countries. Why should it apply to countries that run dictatorially and that are run dictatorially and that present a monolithic face to the outside world? The truth, in my opinion, is that even a country as seemingly monolithic as the Soviet Union has arguments going on in its inner councils in which there exist hidden allies, not allies of our side, but allies of the cause of conciliation and compromise. We do not know exactly what is going on in the Kremlin, but it became quite obvious during the Berlin crisis in 1948 and the Cuban crisis in 1962 that there were differing points of view. Nikita Khrushchev sent President Kennedy 2 messages in 1962. one of which was reasonably conciliatory and the other was blustering and recalcitrant. The President wisely ignored the second message and responded to the first one, which led to a peaceful resolution of the crisis. There was good reason to believe that the second message hadn't been drafted by Khrushchev himself, but that the first one had been drafted by him personally. This analysis enabled us to make a response which appealed to those who wished to get out of confrontation, of a confrontation that carried a serious risk of open hostilities and perhaps nuclear war. So far, I have mentioned the importance of integrity, empathy, creativity, realism, and precision. I have pointed out the need for international agreements to bring benefits to the parties concerned, if they are to be lasting. I have cited examples of agreements that brought benefits to both parties, and one example of a treaty that brought no advantages to anyone and only lulled the world for a while into a false sense of security, to be rudely shattered by World War II. I mentioned the need to present your side's position in terms that will appeal, if not to the negotiators on the other side, then at least to elements that I call hidden allies, but which, of course, are elements that perceive the mutual advantage of a particular formula. For we cannot expect other governments to look out for our interests. That is something we have to do ourselves. I have mentioned that excessive cleverness is not an asset, and that the silver-tongued orator doesn't necessarily make a good negotiator. I should now say a few words about the need not only for perseverance, but also for endurance. And that means not only mental and moral, but also physical endurance. Negotiations sometimes last very long into the night. Especially toward their end, there is a serious danger that in a rush for agreement, mistakes will be made or important details overlooked. There was a time when I was in Saigon when we were negotiating about going to the negotiating table in Paris. That was in 1958, and we had already announced that we were going, only to find that our Vietnamese allies had concerns that they felt had to be satisfied before they could sit at the same table with the Viet Cong. They did not recognize the Viet Cong as a government and wished to see them clearly identified for what they were, namely an appendage of the North Vietnamese delegation. During that period in November '68, we negotiated with President Thieu and his advisors from one morning until well into the next day. During the night, which of course is day in this country, we had to have telephonic as well as telegraphic communication with Washington. Some of you may recall that the shape of the table was the stumbling block. For the North Vietnamese wanted a four-sided table, in which the Viet Cong would have occupied a position co-equal with the South Vietnamese government, whereas the latter wanted a two-sided table, which would identify the Viet Cong as simply part of the other side, and not specifically as a co-equal of the others. The table was both four-sided and two-sided. We had a four-sided table, but then we cut the table in two and separated the two parts. So we considered as two-sided, we were speaking to our side, the other side considered they had a four-sided table, so it seemed to satisfy both. I've already referred to the importance of not trying to play for the galleries, indeed the importance of secrecy in substantive negotiations. But I would like to say a bit more on the subject of public opinion at home and abroad. It seems to me that international negotiation is by and large an occupation from which one should not expect to derive great popularity, nor should one become disheartened if it isn't forthcoming. I've had my share of press attacks. It may surprise some of you, but during the negotiations in the Dominican Republic, the government press called me a communist. The so-called constitutionalistas called me the El Embajador Culebreo, the snake ambassador. Then El Rey de Manganeo, the king of wheeler-dealers. And finally, El Pato Macho de Manganeo, the male duck of wheeler-dealers. In the United States, during the Panama Canal treaties, I received certain unflattering descriptions, but I think the unkindest cut of all, from someone who signed himself a former neighbor who said, "You're told to know what you're doing, you old bastard. Go jump in the river." But the labels I'm proudest of, even though not meant to be particularly flattering, were put to me in Saigon, where some papers called me the blue-eyed sorcerer and others the old refrigerator. I took the latter as a compliment, for it implied remaining cool in the face of provocation and not letting temper interfere with my judgment that I was guided not by passions of the moment, but by the long-term interest of my government. That, in my opinion, coincided at that time with the enlightened self-interest of the government to which I was accredited, even though that government didn't always see it that way. But it seems to me that an American diplomat, and especially an American negotiator, could find inspiration in the remark that was made by President Lincoln during our Civil War. "I do the very best I know how, the very best I can," he said, "and I mean to keep on doing so to the end. If the end brings me out all right, what is said against me won't amount to anything. If the end brings me out wrong, 10 angels swearing I was right would make no difference." Well, in closing, I just want to say how much I've enjoyed the privilege of being on campus at Duke, how much I've enjoyed taking part in the Living History program, which I think, thanks to Mr. Rutherford, Dr. Barber, and others who have taken part in it, really offer great promise of getting a wider view of our foreign problems and the process of negotiation and their importance. How much I envy your campus here, which is so extensive and so beautiful, and your faculty, which has such a high reputation throughout the country, and the privilege of having a man of such distinction and abilities as your president, as Mr. Sanders. So all of these advantages, I think, will prepare you to meet the challenge of this rapidly changing world, and it's going to be an exciting one. Service to you, and prepare you for significant service to your country. Thank you very much.
Developments in the Middle East peace negotiations, and from a diplomatic standpoint, what the prospects are for reaching an agreement.
Yes, I think the accomplishments at Camp David were very significant, and I think that the President and the Israeli and the Egyptian negotiators did a splendid piece of work in getting as far as they did. I think it was unfortunate that the time for signing was set at December 17th, because I think it didn't take into account the fact that it's one thing to develop guidelines, it's another thing to implement the guidelines, and that becomes infinitely more difficult. And this is the problem that they ran into, but I think this is to be expected, so I hope that persistence will through persistence, they will solve the few remaining problems. For example, I worked out guidelines for the principles, 8 principles for the Panama negotiations to serve as guidelines from November to January 73, 74, and the Secretary signed them in February 74, but it took us 4 years to complete the treaties. So, and that happens in treaties that are as difficult as the Panama treaties were, and certainly these are equally more difficult. And even though the treaty between Egypt and Israel is signed and agreed to, there are still tremendous problems ahead in the West Bank, in Jerusalem, in the Golan Heights, which involve Jordan, Syria, and the PLO, which involves the whole Arab world, so that there are many difficulties ahead of us. But it will be a great step forward if these treaties between Egypt and Israel are signed.
The New York Consortium of Banks loaned Panama a substantial amount of money, and it's reported by Panamanian sources that from 20 to 40% of their gross national product is spent servicing and reducing the debt. Part of the money which the U.S. promised in the new treaty might be viewed as, in a way, underwriting this loan. Another point, Saul Lenowitz, who became one of the chief negotiators, apparently or was reported to have a somewhat vested interest in this New York Consortium of Banks. What, in your opinion, if any effect, did this have upon the outcome of the setting of the specific monetary price that the U.S. would pay Panama while we were giving them the canal or phasing the canal over to them?
Those are matters we dealt with, of course, during the negotiations arose. The fact is that the Consortium of New York banks loaned about $100 million to Panama, much less than Panama borrowed elsewhere, overseas and abroad. They have heavy borrowings, well over $1 billion, but New York banks was less than 10% of it. Of the $100 million, the Marine Midland Bank, which Marcelino of which he was a director, had only $5 million participation. He resigned as the director of the Midland Bank when he took on the negotiations. So there's absolutely no foundation in fact that they had any influence.
So you don't think that this will have any effect on our long-term relations with the People's Republic?
If it's limited, as the Chinese seem to indicate it would be, as it was in India, I don't think so, no.
What are your opinions on the normalization of relations with China, and how do you think this will affect our relations with Russia?
Well, I think the Russians were disturbed when we recognized China, and quite disturbed by the fact that we did recognize China. But I think my feeling is that the Russians are pretty pragmatic about things, and I think they'll accept it as a given fact, and determined to live with it as such. I don't think, for example, it will affect our negotiations on the salt agreements. I think the Russians want that as much as we do, and I would expect that will be brought to a successful conclusion. How it will fare in the Senate is another matter. And that's going to be, I think, very difficult. I think it will be a cliffhanger, just as the Panama treaties were. We passed one treaty with one vote to spare and one treaty with 2 votes to spare. And it's hard to get the two-thirds of the Senate to agree on anything, let alone something that's controversial.
Try to get it. Like that, maybe probably a little better for you. Yeah. It wasn't too much of a...
No. Hello.